I can summarize it in one word, Carl: bias. Every human being, whether you want to admit it or not, has a set of biases.
Welcome to the Measure Success podcast, where we feature top leaders on how they measure success in their business and life. Now, let's learn from their experiences.
Carl J. Cox here. I'm the host of the Measure Success podcast, where I talk with top leaders about effective strategies that inspire success. This episode is brought to you by 40 Strategy. 40 Strategy is built to make strategy work for small to medium-sized businesses and organizations by designing world-class strategic plans and, more importantly, help keeping them actually accountable to get it done. To learn more, go to 40strategy.com. We're also really excited that our book, Lost at CEO, has been released. It's an Amazon #1 bestseller in 12 different categories at launch. We encourage you to go out. You can find it on Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com, or Audible.com. And I don't say this in every show, but if you are interested in getting a signed copy, actually email me directly at carljcox@40strategy.com. I will send you a free signed copy of the book. So please go ahead and go for and do that. I'd love to be able to make sure you get the hands on the book. Well, we love to do a shout out from time to time when we get a recommendation from a guest or something really extraordinary happens. And this is Alicia Schwartz, previous podcast guest on the Measure Success podcast, COO of Mathematica, and just an amazing human being. And is so grateful that she introduced me to Sheldon Bernard. We'll probably talk a whole lot today about have some really interesting, fascinating connections and just the way how we've been brought up together and the things that are important in our lives. He's the founder of A440 Management. It's a pioneer in applied decision sciences, specializing in confronting complex issues and the uncertainty. He's pioneered the direct, and this is a trademark, framework to enable organizations to better decisions under uncertainty. He has 15 plus years of expertise. He has led innovative special projects for Fortune 100 executives, leveraging the decision sciences and Bayesian methods and strategic decision making. You're going to hear much more about this today. He is a sought after speaker, expert in what he does, and he's going to blow your mind with what he has been able to say today. And with that, and I should go a little bit further on things you probably won't end up talking about. You also have Wayne State University, MBA from UNC at Chapel Hill, and also receive your certificate in strategic decision and risk management from Stanford. Sheldon, welcome to the Measure Success podcast.
Thanks, Carl. Thanks for having me. Excited to be here. We've been able to chat about a lot of interesting things. So let's see where this goes today.
Absolutely. So Sheldon, give a little bit more context. When somebody brings and asks you to come into a company to help them out, what are you helping them out with?
That's a great question. It's one I get often, especially if I've done a webinar or a talk, because I'm often just talking about the concept of how do you make a decision when there's a lot of uncertainty. So a lot of executives or leaders will say, well, when would we call you? Like, what kind of things do you end up tackling? And the good news is any decision that you've got to make that is uncertain or has a lot of complexity in it, or you're stuck, is something that you call us for. Bad news is that could literally be anything. So we've done work on innovation. Sometimes it's just looking at a particular initiative. Sometimes it's looking at how do you get better at making portfolio decisions for a whole suite of projects or initiatives that a company wants to launch. New products, ventures, R&D. There have been some projects we've worked on that are crisis. Some of the most instructive ones in my discipline for me have been projects that have been, a little bit tougher, a little bit we have to make some really rough choices coming out of this. So it's not always positive. Sometimes we've got to decide if we're keeping this division or not. Sometimes it's, do we settle this lawsuit or do we go to court? Our very first official client work was right in the heart of the pandemic, and it was, does this school system stay open? Right. If you think back to COVID in its early days, we weren't even sure what this was or how bad was it going to be. So do we stay open? Is it safe to bring back the kids? How do we do it? How do we reconcile what the healthcare professionals and the parents and the teachers and all of these different stakeholders want, but then keep kids safe? So that's what I'd say. I think about half of what I'm doing right now is around innovation, because it's just very uncertain. I mean, when you're trying to innovate and come up with a new product that you're going to launch, you've got tons of uncertainty. And so helping companies navigate and get through that is, I'd say, about half of my time right now.
Okay, so let's talk about that for a moment. An organization is considering driving towards, and I'm kind of curious because you mentioned innovation, right? So this is I would still consider ideation form, right? It's prior to a product, an actual product to release. You're in this early stage of should we go down a direction to invest and probably ensure the organizations you're working with tens of millions, hundreds of millions, perhaps billions of dollars, right, into a critical decision. So thinking wisely, thinking differently than we have in the past is so critical. So I'm curious, help for those who are listening going, okay, great. I've done this before, perhaps, right? They're like, oh, I've done this before. I've got through. What is so different about your methodology versus traditional discernment?
I can summarize it in one word, Carl: bias. Every human being, whether you want to admit it or not, has a set of biases. We've got this leaning one way or the other. We tend to look at information a certain way depending on what we want, sometimes just depending on the weather or how crummy of a mood you were in before. So there's all these things that influence how you make your choices. And right, we broadly call those cognitive biases. But then there's some motivational biases as well. So what's very different about what we do, even in the crisis stuff or I've done some M&A work, even in the M&A work, is we always start with bias. We just assume that you're not deliberately going to tackle those without some sort of intervention or some sort of a process. So the very foundation of the direct process is something I call rational from irrational. It's an orientation towards accepting and acknowledging what we're really trying to do is get rational thinking and behavior from humans that are typically not rational, they're irrational. So everything that we do is embedded with some kind of a hack or a nudge or a way to hedge against that bias. So that's where we start. So we don't start with like what you refer to as the normative steps, like here's a lean innovation framework or here's some design thinking. We step back and say, okay, your brain is going to deceive you. It is going to trick you above anything else externally that could possibly trick you. But we know the ways in which it's probably going to do that, given what you're trying to do. So we start there, and then we'll build the process of the analysis from that upwards. So it's almost like I'm flipping this thing on its head and saying, yeah, I'm sure that there are some great frameworks you learn in business school or in your experience. But if we don't address the fact that you're going to come into that framework with a set of biases, you won't get anything out of it.
So why I'm smiling so much, if anyone's listening or watching on YouTube right now, is because of one of my things that I pull my hair out, so to speak, is the SWOT analysis, right? SWOT analysis has been around since the 60s, I think it is, if I got that correct. And actually, I think, matter of fact, Intel was one of the earlier, there was a company in Stanford, matter of fact, back in Stanford, was like one of the first organizations that helped come up with the SWOT analysis. And interestingly enough, what drives me crazy from it is the bias that's inherently built into it. So for example, what does this mean? Often somebody will bring up, what's your strengths? And they'll say, we have great people.
Yeah.
Okay. And it's like, that is so unhelpful. We have great people. Great. Of course you think you're great. Of course you think the people around you, because that's why you're meeting with them right now in a meeting for leadership. Let's try to understand more deeper. So let me just touch that for just a moment.
Yeah.
Just that simple concept. We think we have great people, which is a bias, right? How do you get people to think about that differently so they remove that bias?
That's a great question. This one comes up in a lot of different ways. So in innovation, I see it a lot in trust the innovators we've got. Maybe nobody deliberately says we have great people, but the behavior is basically saying we have great people. And depending on how that manifests, I think my tendency is to ask, well, what do you mean by great people? As in they're good human beings? As in they're excellent innovators? As in they're the right person to take this particular idea and launch it in this market so that it produces value in this particular world that you're envisioning in a few years? Because nobody innovates to put something in the market for yesterday or today. Right. It's for tomorrow or 2 or 3 years down the road. And I find that if I can start to specify, like when you say great or when you're implying great people, what do you mean by great? Because I think part of the fear is, especially in innovation, there's this fear of not wanting to discourage people because we all know that it's going to be hard. We all know that it has high failure rates. So we don't want to say anything negative to the people who are actually doing the innovation, because that might derail them. And in a large company, if you decide to go into innovation, you're taking career risk because you're not in the core business, right? You're not managing a P&L. So there's this overhang or this really weird sense of wanting to, I don't want to say coddle because that's not really what I mean, right? But it's be very soft glove with the people who are doing that work. And there are some times where you've got to get really clear and say, you are all great human beings and you're all very creative and innovative, but are you the right person for this set of objectives? And I'm sure you see it all the time in your work is it's not until you get people to articulate what great is that they can start to scrutinize with whether or not what they're doing is going to enable them to achieve that or miss it. So that's where my head goes when I think about how I've seen that one show up. Is yeah, they're probably great people, but are they great in the context of what you need them to do right now? And kind of gives the freedom to say, hey, we're going to outsource this. We're going to get an expert to come in. We're going to have another team work on this without feeling like, oh gosh, I just shut down some of my quote unquote innovators, in a world where we don't have many of them. But it's a tough one. It comes up all the time.
And I love your discussion around that is a great way to take the next level is you said, let's define great. And what does great actually mean in context of what we're trying to accomplish? So is that even a benefit descriptor, right, of going forward? Instead, then we can go, oh, this is actually going to potentially help us or hurt us. Sheldon, you often work with, once again, Fortune 100 companies where they have resources, right? A lot of the companies we work with often don't have the deep level resources. The irony, though, is with the SWOT analysis, got born Porter's 5 forces, right? Because he was so frustrated with SWOT because it was not creating good information because of what he saw. So he created a wonderful, decent framework to nail into it deeper. But then what happened was frankly, very few people could do Porter's 5 forces, right? They literally don't have the ability to do it. And so it's like this brilliant theory that is so hard to apply in principle and actual premises. And so therefore, despite how wonderful it is, it's like, I'm still stuck, right? I'm still stuck. And so they went back to the SWOT, right? That's what happened. Everyone went back to the SWOT. It's like, because it's easy. I could still do this.
Man, that is really good insight. I've never thought about it, but I use both. So much of what I do requires workshops because I'm the expert on how to make decisions under uncertainty. Very rarely will I ever be the expert on your business. So much of my role and much of what the folks who I work with do is we facilitate. And the SWOT and Porter's 5 forces are kind of go-to tools. And it wasn't until you said it that I realized I see the same thing. So I find Porter's very helpful in understanding like how tough is it for you to win in this world that you're trying to launch this thing in. Is this going to be a knife fight for you? Like how much competition, which I think is what Michael Porter was really trying to get to. And teams struggle using it and coming up with it. And it's been very bizarre. I'm like, well, that's interesting. Now, what you and I do, we're abstract, right? So we're always on the outside thinking about the process and how do we kind of coach and facilitate people there. So I have a bias in thinking, well, this shouldn't be that bad, but it's like pulling teeth, man. So then, we'll default and say, oh, well, let's go back to the SWOT. But then you get to the SWOT and I see tons of biases. Well, here's the strength. Well, says who? How do you know that's a strength? What is the credible data that tells you that this is a strength, right? Compared to what? And there's an interesting interplay between those two tools that I hadn't thought about until you just mentioned it. But there's bias in the SWOT. We want to downplay the threats and the weaknesses. We want to overestimate the strengths. And then when it comes to Porter's, what I see, I'd be curious your observation is people being very narrow in how they're thinking about those forces. Very, very narrow. Well, rivalry is, right, they're defining it too narrowly. I'm like, well, what about these 4 or 5 other things out there that the consumer would say, well, I'm just going to choose that. And you may consider them technically your competition, but they really are.
And that's a great example there, right, of the alternative. It's often, it might not necessarily be you or the competition. It's like they're putting their eyeballs or their money to something else. And your product that you've been delivering all this research into, if you can't get people to understand what it is and the value that is bringing, it'll never see the light of day. It'll never, or at least create value. It might come out, but nobody's going to buy it, right? Because you've forgotten the other components that's so critical in helping move through the relevancy, the value, of moving through. And this, by the way, this bias, once again, the buying side right? I work with a client right now and they have this wonderful product that works 50% to sometimes double the value of in terms of quality than their competitor. Of course, they charge a bit more, right? They charge 20% more. But somebody who's just thinking short term and they have a system, they're like, I need to get my system to be the cheapest possible. So they put the cheapest tool in there. So they will lose out on those opportunities. But as soon as that dies, they come in aftermarket, right? But the buyers, right, initially their bias is I need to save money. They're not thinking about the replacement costs or the long-term maintenance value, right? There's so many different components when it comes down to the buyer, right? And who's influencing, who's making those different decisions. And you could have the greatest idea in the world. So, Sheldon, I know we're already going to have another podcast because there's so much we could talk about and we're going to have limited time today. But I just want to touch briefly on, of course, the biggest thing, I think it's fair to say in my lifetime is generative AI. So talk about changing bias. First of all, I'm seeing for the majority are completely frozen. They do not know what to do. You have the big companies, big co's who are already in software are just all over this. And what we're going to see over the next 3 years is going to be extraordinary coming out of them. And then you have companies, once again, that the in between, the people we don't know what we don't know are in this whole Porter's Five Forces. We think we're competing against something, but we're actually competing against something we can't even see. So I'm just kind of curious, as you're, and I'm sure in some of the innovation decision making, you're helping organizations out with this. How do you help them understand that next level application of innovation, of going, okay, we got to totally rethink this principle because we're not just competing against this, we're competing against anybody now. If you've seen HeyGen, HeyGen, and the avatars that they create, this is a 50-person company came up with something now people are clamoring over because it now can have incredible ability for us to not even do our own speaking, and an avatar on our behalf will do train a presentation.
It's
like
getting
this is
better too.
Yes, getting better and better and better. Help me with that. How are you helping organizations to see this massive change in the way it's impacting the world? So once again, they stop their bias and really rethink the whole paradigm.
It's a tougher one to your point. We're just started getting into some of it. We use generative AI and like machine learning approaches. Back in the day, we just called it statistical learning, but right, that is, A440 is a Bayesian firm. So we are here to basically democratize Bayesian approaches, which is a branch of statistics, much older, much more intuitive, but it deploys a lot of the stuff that is becoming more popular today. So I just want to acknowledge my bias there. But that worldview means what you believe, the information you've already had, has to be combined with new evidence, then give you an updated belief. So how does that help me answer the question you've asked? Is one, what I have noticed is the way the data analysis revolution or even the data science revolution has happened in corporate has been too much about precision, too much about the tools and how good is this algorithm or how good is this machine learning model. And so there's an orientation towards like precision and refinement of tools, where the Bayesian world says, well, who cares about the tool? The tool is there to serve a particular decision that you think you need to make. And so if you don't get that clear, and then you're not willing to be transparent about what you already know, what you already believe, whatever additional information that a tool is going to give you isn't going to be what we would say coherent. You've got to have all pieces of those. So what I'm finding is this whole wave of generative AI, the organizations that seem to be stuck, because I think they're thinking of it too much of a tool. It's a tool. How do we use this tool as opposed to what are the big problems that we think we need to solve? What are the problems that we think we're uniquely able to solve today? And how does this tool introduce new competition, new collaborators, new approaches to do what we're doing quicker? Or how is it just going to change the way we have to interact with the customer? Right. So if you think of it as a tool, I think it's harder because then you get lost in the weeds of, is it a large language model? Are we going to go with a general purpose transformer? Are we going to, whatever the next flavor, because we're not done, right? Transformers aren't the last version of this. And you can start looking at that. But if you can be focused on, well, what are the choices we think we make better than our competition today? What are the choices we need to be better about in the future? How is the customer or the consumer choosing? And now overlay this tool on top of that. I think your discussion changes. That's where we've been trying to move it is forget about the tools. 5 years, forget 5 years. 5 months from now, somebody may have another one. Right. It's not just Chat GP. There's large language models all over the place. Many of them open source. You know, it's been shocking to me about all of this. I have a client that has one of the most curated databases of their own history and information. Every business review, you name it, a mountain of this information that no human could ever ingest. And they face future challenges by thinking that everything that they're facing is brand new, where they've got decades of information of things that are similar. And I was talking to somebody over there and I said, and the generative AI thing came, I said, if you just decided to build one and stick it on your own data, right? Think Oracle at Delphi, or think, some of the tribal cultures that would go and talk to the elders and get wisdom. I'm like, have you ever thought about that? I mean, you're thinking about how do I stop employees from loading stuff into Chat GPT so that our secrets are out there? Or how do I use Chat GPT to write better emails? But I'm thinking the world is changing and you're facing many disruptions. You've been here for 50, 60 years. You got records of every choice you've made and what the world was like and all this information. Why don't you stick the generative AI on top of your own data?
Yes.
And smarter about using your own wisdom, right? It was like a deer in headlights moment. And I was like, yeah,
That's so awesome.
You guys have a tool orientation and not a value or problem orientation. So that's a long-winded answer, but that's how I've been thinking about it lately is this really about the tool and the technology, or is it about the problem that can solve?
Yes. Yes. I thank you. And once again, thank you. This is what's being missed often, right? Is once again, where is the value being created? Let's think about the think, right? Of like,
Yeah.
it's so mind blowing, right? For so many of us, these capabilities that are there that we can use, and it's so much cheaper, right, than it used to be. That's what really the game changer, right? Is that we didn't have access to this information, but you're right. It's right there. What's interesting, and you're in my world, what I call meaning traditional strategic planning and execution, I think is going to be one of the hardest ones to get towards because we know the data is really bad. We're already really bad at it. And then on top of that, meaning, once again, I think PwC said 97% of strategic plans fail. We know that 90% of plans fail to get 2/3 of their strategic objectives, and we know that. But what we are missing, the real value is not that. The real value is, did people track the actual strategy that they tried and then the actual outcome that came out of it? And when we are willing to share that truth, that result can be remarkable. And I'm not saying it doesn't exist anywhere, just to clarify. I mean, obviously,
Rare, man.
it's not
I
very
haven't
good.
seen it. I don't see it
Okay.
at all.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I hope you
Yeah.
do.
No, well, once again, I go a little bit tactical when I talk about that for a moment. There's probably, for example, strategies and marketing tactics, for example, that we can see some level of success or not success by trying different things. That's very, very granular, going really deep. It's really more tactical than it is strategic. But once again, we make these different decisions, that is what I get excited about. I get excited about that future. But what it requires is, of course, humility, because people have to be willing to document what didn't work. And that is something we're not very good with in business. We're pretty good in military, and we're pretty good in different areas, right? Of going, hey, we want to make sure we don't make a mistake again.
Mhm.
Or like National Weather Service, right? They care about this stuff because it's saving people's lives. On the business side, we're embarrassed because, like you're Sheldon, you're saying we don't want to lose our job. And so very rarely do people go back and truly document the truth behind a strategic decision from 2 or 3 years ago. We've already moved on to our next annual operating plan, already scrapped our previous part, and we're already looking ahead into the next 3 to 5 years. What a mistake. These are the things that once we get the humility to go to there, it could be profound and dramatic. But till then, you and I are going to stay very busy.
Until then, you and I are going to stay very busy because I'm a believer in the human spirit, and that once we decide to, right, as a society of beings, we can accomplish anything. I am very concerned about, do we have the will to do what you just mentioned, right? Because again, from a Bayesian perspective, we would say that's a prior. What did you believe prior before seeing any information or any data? And we want it to be there and transparent. We want everybody to be able to dissect it and understand it. And we're going to get information. We're going to combine that with what we thought. And we're going to say, now what do we believe?
Mm.
And then we're going to rinse and repeat, and we're going to keep doing that cycle. That requires a level of transparency and a desire to not be right, but to just win. And as I've spent time with financial institutions, in particular, a couple of like really early hedge funds, and like how they think, the opposite. They don't care about being quote unquote right. They just care about winning. So they will do what you and I just suggested, because they continue making bad investment decisions just because I get a warm and fuzzy, but there's risk of me losing capital. No, right? It's not tolerated. So they want to be right. So right, what I've learned is traders at that level carry trade journals. Here's what I was thinking. Here's about how I thought about the entry, what I thought were going to be the signals to exit. Here's what I did. When they go back, and the best of the best, right? That stuff is hard coded into their algorithms, which manage their positions. So that was a big aha for me. It's like, this cycle that you're talking about, being very clear about what was our strategy, why was it the strategy, and then what happened, and what do we keep and what do we trash based on what we learn. It happens in some sectors of the economy, but in most of them, in the ones that I operate in, I don't see it. I would love to, but I don't really see it.
Yeah, total opportunity. It's interesting. My company where I work with, Cascade, I know Tom Wright has this dream a bit of being able to collect and understand all of these different decisions, right? But once again, even the challenge, even in software, is they won't go back and validate the truth because people want to hide it. They don't want to go through and say this is something I failed at, and they're missing is the opportunity of learning, right? Once again, to learn. Hey, let's not go down that hole again, right? Let's not make that mistake again, because we can learn from our decisions in the past. That will be profound if we can get to there.
Yeah, and you know what it requires? I totally forgot that. I didn't mention this. Is so bias is one of the places we start. Right? Our foundation is understanding bias, in particular heuristics. There's mechanisms and shortcuts that your brain takes that lead you to be biased. The next thing is a decision and an outcome are not the same thing. They're not. If you drive drunk and get home safely, that does not, you getting home safely as an outcome does not make your decision to drive drunk good. And the inverse is also true. I drive very safely and I'm conscientious and I'm sober and I get in a fatal car wreck. Doesn't mean me driving sober was a bad choice. And what we tend to reward in businesses are outcomes. And you'll hear it like,
That's right.
We judge, we gauge and we reward based on results. And I understand why. What we've done is we put ourselves into a loop where it's implied that the quality of your decision making, as long as you get a good result. But if you think about that, that's where, so what will keep me employed for a long time, that particular fallacy, right? Because if I make crummy decisions, if I have a terrible decision-making process and I got lucky in 2 or 3 things that have elevated my career, but I continue to make choices that way with that broken process or paradigm, that's going to blow up sooner or later. And then you're going to be calling Carl or you're going to be calling A440, but either way, right? So we somehow have to be able to shift the paradigm towards how good are our choices. We make really good choices. That's our insurance policy against having many bad outcomes.
Sheldon, I just want to say, because there's so many, once again, we haven't even scratched the surface, and I haven't even asked you my basic questions that I ask regularly.
Yeah.
Would you be open to being on again on the Measure Success podcast?
Absolutely.
Okay. All right. We're going to do this again. We're going to have a round 2, and we're gonna end this one. But this has been a fabulous discussion, and we're getting here is some of the root of the root, right? Is the why behind the why. And this is what people forget. We have these paradigms, we have these concepts and these models, and we think just because we use the model, it's right. And you and I both know it's often wrong. And helping to think differently and using the concepts that you've developed and designed. This is what I'm consistently trying to do a facilitation. We need to rethink our thinker, if you may, to help make sure we get better results. So Sheldon, once again, we're going to skip all the fun questions that we talk regularly. Thank you so much for being a guest on the Measure Success podcast today.
Man, I couldn't be happier to have spent this time with you. Thanks, Carl.
And to everyone else who's listening, I hope you've enjoyed this conversation. I hope you've been geeking out as much as Sheldon and I have. This has been a wonderful conversation, and it's truly about how we can become more wise in the long run of making truly an extraordinary difference for the organizations that we're with. And so I'm so grateful to connect with Sheldon. Hang on just for a minute, Sheldon. We're going to get you your swag, as we always love to do. And to everyone else who's listening, We hope you've enjoyed this. Please go out and rate our show. And as I mentioned, if you are interested in our book, please send me an email, carljcox@40strategy.com, and we will get you a signed copy of the book. With that, wishing you the very best at measuring your success. Have a great day.
Thanks for listening to the Measure Success podcast. We'll see you again next time to learn from the best. Remember to subscribe now to get future episodes.